Welcome. I truly can't think of two people who would be better placed to talk about promoting entrepreneurship across the United States. I want to start by going back a little bit. Both of you grew up outside of tech hubs. Steve, you grew up in Hawaii, and Chase in Kansas. And yet you've both built these careers that are really on the bleeding edge of technology and innovation. And I'm curious how coming of age outside of some of the centers of gravity of tech have shaped both the way that you invest, but also your North Star when it comes to engaging with entrepreneurs.
You want to start?
Steve, you go ahead.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and great to be with Chase. We partnered together on a lot of things, including trying to drive more capital to more entrepreneurs in more parts of the country, and kind of level the playing field, and give more people kind of a shot at the American dream, and create jobs in the process. My own backstory, as you said, I was born and raised in Hawaii. Both my parents were born and raised in Hawaii, so our family goes back over a century. And I was there until I went to college. And it was a great place to grow up, but it was a little bit kind of off the beaten path. We actually, at the time, got television shows a week later because they had to send the tapes by plane. The satellites hadn't quite, kind of emerged yet. So it just felt like a little bit off the beaten path. And then after going to college, I worked for a while in Cincinnati, Ohio for Procter & Gamble, and actually worked in Wichita, Kansas for a division of PepsiCo at the time called Pizza Hut, and then moved to Northern Virginia outside of DC, where we started America Online, AOL. So that journey gave me some sense of how some people in some places, while they have great ideas, don't necessarily have the same opportunity that if they had been in, say, Silicon Valley or some other place, which I think has motivated, my efforts to try to, level the playing field.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. I've lived in a lot of different places, but moved back to Wichita a few years after college. And, my first job was actually in Kansas, not in Wichita. When my old man sent me away to the feed yard when I was 15, I had a really bad attitude. So he said, "You're going to go shovel cow manure and dig post holes for your welcome to Koch Industries." So that was my kind of welcome to Koch moment. But I ended up coming back to Wichita, where Koch Industries headquarters is, because we love the Kansas and the Wichita community, and primarily just because of the value system that we've experienced there and the people in that community and the people that we can draw from. I think one of the biggest differentiators of Koch is really Koch Industries is our talent vision and how we look at that. And I kind of summarize it as we're trying to hire the farm team. And what I mean by that is kids that are contribution motivated, strong work ethic, and they've been there, done that. And when you hire them, they come in wanting to make a contribution, as opposed to like kind of an entitlement philosophy. And so we hire from a lot of those schools, locally in that area. And if you look around the boardroom today, a lot of them, come from Kansas or some of these like smaller schools that don't get as much recognition, but it's because we hire on values first, skills second. And we believe when you come in, you can learn the skills, but really the core decision is around values. So that's why we've stayed in Kansas as well.
Steve, you started a seed fund called Rise of the Rest, and I hoped that maybe you could tell us a little bit about what inspired the creation of that fund. I know you also have a book coming out.
I have a book here. I have to hold it up and promote it. Comes out in 2 weeks. Simon & Schuster. Pre-order now on Amazon.
Yeah, pre-order your copies now. And maybe you can tell us about the bus tours as well.
Yeah, no, what happened was I was asked about 10 years ago to launch a White House initiative called Startup America, which got me traveling around and starting to understand, sort of what was happening and the fact that there was, creativity everywhere, but not opportunity everywhere. And then we decided to take the next step about 8 years ago, started doing these Rise of the Rest bus tours where we'd travel from city to city, spend a lot of time in each city. We've done that now in dozens and dozens of cities, Detroit and Pittsburgh and Minneapolis and Denver, Nashville, you name it. A lot of pretty good representation of the country. And again, we saw firsthand that there are great things happening in these places, but it was harder for them to get attention of venture capitalists who were largely on the coast. So then we launched 4 or 5 years ago a Rise the Rest seed fund, and we said, let's go collect some of the most successful individual entrepreneurs and investors, including the Koch family and the Walton family and hedge fund people like Ray Dalio and private equity people like Henry Kravis and David Rubenstein, venture capitalists like John Doerr, Jim Breyer, Meg Whitman, Tory Burch, kind of Sarah Blakely. It's a really amazing group of people who all joined with us to create this fund. And so far, we've invested in 200 companies in over 100 cities. And some of them are really breaking out to be very significant, very valuable companies. And we said when we started, we believe this would be a top quartile fund, that we would be able to prove that the investing in these entrepreneurs really makes sense. And that has proven to be the case. And the reason I decided to write the book, which actually finished 6 months ago, but because of the publishing industry and supply chain and so forth, it's just coming out in a couple of weeks, is these are remarkable stories that we wanted to make sure people understood what was happening in these cities all across the country, the entrepreneurs that are reimagining industries that are really important parts of our lives and doing it from places that might surprise people. And I think people who read the book will have a better sense of what's happening all across the country, and also have a little bit more optimistic view of the future of America, because people are doing this at sort of a grassroots level that is largely off the radar. Most of the companies in San Francisco or New York or Boston get most of the attention, they get most of the venture capital, and we want to change that, and that's what Rise of the Rest is all about.
Great. Chase, I know you've also been involved in Rise of the Rest as an investor. I'm curious from your perspective, what do you think other investors are missing out on when they focus their attention only on Silicon Valley or New York?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, when I launched KDT, the first bet I made was on Steve, actually, in the Rise of the Rest, because his thesis was so clear to us. And the whole idea of Rise of the Rest. I mean, I told kind of the Kansas story and why that's important to us. But it's because entrepreneurs are everywhere. And if you look at our portfolio in Koch Disruptive Technologies, we started a little over 4.5 years ago. We have about 50 companies, and if you look at them across those companies, 85% are outside of the 3 core markets. There's nothing wrong with Silicon Valley or New York or Boston. I'm in those markets all the time and have great relationships and there's great companies, but there's great founders everywhere. In the U.S. and also, we're outside of the U.S. as well. Israel has been a really significant presence for KDT. Have a local team on the ground there, and about 40% of the capital that we've deployed is actually in Israel. And the why on that is it all comes down to where do you have with founders vision alignment, values alignment, and bring complementary capabilities. And if you take the Israel example, and why would you start in it? Because the first direct investment after investing in Steve was in a company called Inside Tech, and we made, it was medical technology, which Koch at the time didn't have strong presence in, and it was in Israel, which we had never made a bet in. They're like, why are you starting there? But it was because we saw such high mutual benefit in what Koch could bring to that market. They do a fantastic job of building technology, but they struggle sometimes to commercialize it globally. And we're in 70 countries. We have 120,000 employees, and we touch the majority of the economy. So that value add to them was a big deal, and they are bringing the technology to us. So it was really a good marriage with that market, and why we've continued to invest there.
The other thing I should have added is when people think of these rising cities, they understand that because of this imbalance in terms of venture capital, there's sometimes the valuations would be lower, and the cost of living and the cost of operating will be lower, so whatever money you raise can go further. But there's something much more fundamental in addition, which is in the industries that are getting disrupted in this next phase, healthcare, food and agriculture, things like that. The technology is really just the table stakes to get in the game. It's building partnerships to have systems level change, which is really where the value is created. Well, a lot of the key partners you need, say in healthcare, are in the middle of the country. Places like Minnesota because of Mayo Clinic and United Health, or Ohio because of the Cleveland Clinic, those could be transformative in terms of your businesses, and being closer to them makes sense. And also being in a place that has some domain expertise. A company we backed in Chattanooga called FreightWaves built a logistics platform, kind of like a Bloomberg system for the trucking industry. I didn't know this till I was in Chattanooga, but most of the big trucking companies are based in Chattanooga. So if you want to do that, you should be in Chattanooga. Or a company we backed in Fayetteville, Arkansas, created a platform called Acre Trader for people to invest in farmland. He actually started initially, he was in San Francisco, but he moved to Arkansas because he said, if I'm going to try to build a platform to get farmers to sell part of the interest in their farms to investors, I better be close to them, and so I can build those relationships and build those trusts. So there are some, kind of financial aspects to it in terms of valuations are lower, cost of operations lower, and so forth. But I think what is going to surprise people in the next decade is how many companies launch in cities where that really is the best city to be. It's not a kind of a second-class Plan B kind of city. It is the best city to launch and scale that company. That's what's going to change the paradigm over the next decade.
Chase, you mentioned that Koch Industries has a bit of an unusual approach to hiring and talent development, that you're thinking a lot about moving away from traditional credentials. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, no, I love this question. And actually, Steve helped me with this. So back to the whole hire on values first, skills second. And then also we have a different approach on not only finding companies, but people that might not have the credentials or from the kind of the fancy school and the fancy degree, but they're contribution motivated. They have an innate gift for a specific thing, and where most companies look at a resume and say, okay, GPA, or they went to this school or that school, throw these resumes out. We've really disrupted our process and thought about credentials completely different. And the example that Steve introduced me to a guy at one of his events, Jacob Sue, that built a company called Catalyte that's using data science to identify innate capability in people. Forget about the resume. And what do they have? And so I don't fully understand all the data science and how that works, but we, because of our vision at Koch, we wanted to experiment with Catalyte, and we brought in Jacob, and we paid for a couple pilots to bring people in. And these are folks that we have. Someone in Koch security that runs the night shift that was interested and said, oh, I can learn software engineering and do it in 2 or 3 months, as opposed to having to pay $100,000 of college and do that. And so Catalyte and Jacob came in and trained up 25 people, and most of them are doing incredibly well and completely transformed their lives, right? And so we learned from Catalyte, can we do this across not just software engineering capability, but other places that were short capability. So accounting is one of those areas. So we said, let's just take this into our own hands and create our own Koch accounting program. You don't need to go to college. Come to Koch and we'll teach you on the fly. You'll get a certificate that says, you got the Koch accounting degree and you're making money along the way. So we want to do that with every capability we have where we're short talent. I know Google's doing some of this as well, but that's, again, whether it's companies or people, everyone has a gift. And so what we work on is trying to figure out how do you remove the barriers to unlock the potential. And if I could just say, empowering entrepreneurs, the way I personally think about that, and the theme of this panel, where I spend my time is kind of the intersection of technology, social change, and music. So you may think, well, how does all that fit together? But there's entrepreneurs across all 3 of those dimensions, right? So KDT invests in technology entrepreneurs. On the social change side, on our philanthropy, Stand Together, we look for social change entrepreneurs. Let me just give you one example to kind of bring this out. 5 or 6 years ago, in part of our community strategy that focuses on poverty, addiction, violence, mental health, and really trying to find bottom-up solutions to actually really transform people's lives. We met this gentleman, Scott Strode, who's the founder of a group called The Phoenix. And Scott battled addiction, alcohol and drug addiction most of his life. And what he found was exercise was what actually, he shifted his focus to that, because someone said, I'm going to get you in the boxing ring, I'm going to get you on a bike, and he was a transformed person. So he built a gym that basically combined the power of exercise with the power of community. And so when we found him and we saw the results he had some of the lowest relapse rates in the country, people that went through his gym. We said, how do we take you from 3 gyms to scale this across the country? And so the last 5 years, Stand Together has partnered with the Phoenix to go from 3 gyms to over 80. And we helped them build a kind of a virtual technology overlay. And we think, when we met him, he was probably touching in the hundreds of people, and we think by 2025, he will touch 1 million people. So that's what Stand Together is all about. I mean, and he's a founder, right? Empowering founders that have a gift, but maybe have all these barriers stacked against them. How do we supercharge them with capital and capability? And we're doing the same with musicians and bringing them in to Stand Together as well. So that's what charges me up and gets me out of bed in the morning, is focusing on those kind of 3 areas and just finding those entrepreneurs that are going to change the way the world works.
Yep. I want to come back to Stand Together in a second, but very quickly on moving away from credentials-based hiring, let's do a little magical thinking here. In 50 years, let's say, when I'm talking to my grandchildren, this is for either of you, do you envision that I will say, yeah, we used to have these things called resumes and transcripts, and now we don't use that anymore to get a job? Like, is that where we're headed? Is that where we should be headed?
Well, I think it'll be a mix, but I think the idea that you are your resume, I think most people realize is incomplete. And there are a lot of people who have, as Chase was saying, great skills that maybe have not been fully developed. So figuring out ways to discover that, and this company, Catalyte in Baltimore, is an example of that, and then give them those skills as part of it, but then figuring out how to give them a credential that allows them to get a job they otherwise wouldn't have gotten. And so clearly there's a shift towards, not just, kind of where you went to school and, what your grades were, but what are your capabilities, whether you went to school or not. So there'll always be some value, obviously, in terms of the branding, if you will, of where you work. And so it kind of helps people sort through things, but that ends up leaving a lot of people out. So figuring out ways to get more people into the workforce, get the people, as Chase was saying, who are maybe making, whatever it is, $15,000 or $20,000 or $25,000 a year, and giving them the opportunity to make $50,000 or $75,000 or $100,000 a year is critical. And then obviously the focus of what we're doing with Rise to Rest is how do you find those entrepreneurs with ideas in places that maybe people aren't paying attention, and give them a shot. The data, for those who don't know it, is over the last decade, if you look at venture capital, 75% of venture capital has gone to 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states are fighting over the remaining 25%. Now that's starting to change. There's 1,400 new venture firms have started in the last decade in different Rise to Rest cities around the country. The funding is up 6-fold for the entrepreneurs in those cities, but still it's dominated by a few places on the coast. And that's going to shift. And as Chase said, Silicon Valley is awesome, will continue to be awesome. I think we hit peak Silicon Valley probably 3 or 4 years ago, and people are now starting to realize, including because of the pandemic, that there's a little bit more flexibility about where you live and where you work and how you live and how you work, and that's going to result in a real acceleration of what's happening in these rising cities. So investors out there, I just encourage you to pay more attention to what's happening in these surprising places, and I think you'll be surprised. Even every time I go to a city, I kind of walk away saying, wow, I never thought that was possible in this city or that city, and there are more and more of those stories, which is obviously why I decided to write the book and try to put them all in one place.
So both of you are very involved in policy conversations around entrepreneurship and economic development. And Steve, you serve on the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the Department of Commerce. Chase, you have co-founded Stand Together, which you've told us a little bit about.
Co-chair. My father founded Stand Together.
Okay, co-chair.
I'm in leadership with him.
For both of you, I'm curious how you think government and public sector organizations can work together to advance entrepreneurship in the country.
Well, ultimately, the entrepreneurs have to lead, and investors in the private sector have to back them. But I think governments do, not just in this country, but around the world, sort of set the table. How do you create the right environment so innovation, entrepreneurship can flourish, which is, frankly, the American story. 250 years ago, America was a startup, and it almost, like many startups, almost hit the wall. It almost didn't make it, but was able to figure out a way to survive in those early days, and then led the way in the agricultural revolution, then led the way in the industrial revolution, then led the way in the digital revolution, and went from being this little startup nation to being the leader of the free world with the leading economy. How do we continue to have that pioneering spirit? How do we continue to be a magnet for talent so people from all around the world want to be here? How do we make sure our education system is supportive of this next generation of innovators and creative thinking? And how do we do that in a more inclusive way? And it's not just about place. One of the things this National Advisory Council is doing is on some regional hubs, and Congress passed some legislation just in the last couple of months that's going to fund more investment in these regional hubs, which I think will be super helpful. We're also focusing on sort of industries of the future. What are the key things that really need to get attention? But we're trying to mobilize things at more of a local level so that people really can imagine possibilities they otherwise wouldn't have imagined, and create more collaboration across our Rise of the Rest network. So, governments, as I said, set the table with their basic policies, and then hopefully it invites people to take those risks, and hopefully it's not just happening at a more of a national level, it's also happening at a city and state level, which will allow this to really flourish. And then the last point, going back to the data I mentioned on 75% of the capital going to 3 states, the other 2 data points that trouble me and should trouble you is if you look at not just place, but also people, that for the past decade, even though women are 50% of the population, they get under 10% of venture capital. Even though black Americans are 13% of the population, they get under 1% of venture capital. So it does matter where you live. It does matter what you look like, whether if you have an idea, you have a real shot at building a company that can change the world and create jobs, and you can personally live the American dream. We just have to change that, and that ultimately, as I said, it's the community level, it's the entrepreneurs, it's the investors, but there is a role for government to kind of set the table.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of back up high-level framing, I mentioned Scott Strode in the example. That's a great example of an entrepreneur we would help around a community's strategy on overcoming addiction. If you take one step up from that, what Stand Together is all about, all of our philanthropic activity, it's this group of about 700 plus business leaders from around the country that all rally around the idea that every human being has a gift. And to unlock the potential of that gift, you have to remove barriers. We talked about how we're trying to do that at Koch Industries with resumes, et cetera. But through Stand Together, we think about those barriers being built up over time in the education system. So we work on transforming education in communities, poverty, addiction, violence, mental health, but also on the policy side. There's a lot of policy barriers that are holding people back. And many of you in the audience are probably thinking, yeah, I've heard of Koch in politics, right? We've learned a lot. And really thinking about not politics, thinking about policy and focusing on policy that really improves people's lives, right? What are the things that are holding people back? And one of the biggest learnings over the course of the last few decades was this principle of working with anyone to do right, and not thinking about different folks in different segments and this tribal nature. I don't think about Republican versus Democrat or what and I think this is one of the biggest problems in society is to think about, well, who can I work with? How do I engage in a conversation where I can figure out what I do agree with an individual on and then go work on that? A great example of that is Van Jones. We worked with him on criminal justice reform and really were leaders around getting the First Step Act through. And look, we disagree with Van on a number of things. He disagrees with us on a number of things as well. But we saw that we had alignment on an issue, and we both had capability to actually drive social change around a big problem in this country. And so to me, the more examples we have where people work together on things that they can agree on instead of thinking about tribes, disrupting divisiveness is I think, is what's going to move the country forward. So that's what a big part of what we're trying to do at Stand Together.
Great. Final question for both of you. If you were building a new company today, what city would you build it in?
Well, you'd answer Wichita.
That is
It
my
can be
answer.
without regards to your own personal,
I would say
where
it
you have
depends
roots.
on what industry I was trying to disrupt.
Okay.
There might be some personal, family, lifestyle considerations, but I think in this next wave I talked about, there's certain cities where it'd be best if you're focused on healthcare, or best if you're focused on farming, or best if you're focused on logistics. So find the city that best meets the needs of that company and has the best potential partnerships with that company, and then assemble a team, because entrepreneurship is a team sport.
Yeah,
I'll call that a non-answer, but thank you, Steve.
Well, it's not like we
I'm just
invest in
kidding.
100 cities. Like asking,
Yeah.
what's your favorite child? Of course you love all your children.
I go to what Steve's saying as well, but go back to like culture and like why Israel was a good fit for us and why we're there is where vision, values, complementary capabilities, and then where the talent is around that very specific thing you're trying to build.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Help
Thanks.
the rest rise.